Hi, and welcome to an installment of Overthink podcast and YouTube channel's series on aphorisms, where two philosophy professors talk about an aphorism, reflect off the cuff on it. I'm Ellie Anderson.
And I'm David Peña-Guzmán.
And today we are going to be talking about an aphorism from Emil Cioran. So David, why don't you go ahead and introduce it?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about an aphorism from Cioran's The Trouble with Being Born. Cioran was a Romanian-French philosopher who is known for his non-traditional style of writing. As a philosopher, he believed that aphorisms are a good way to express deep truths in what he called momentary truths. Mm-hmm. So an aphorism is something that is true in the moment of its being written.
I'm very much in the existential tradition in that sense, as well as in the contents of his philosophy.
Yeah. There are pessimistic strands to his thinking, existentialist ones, of course. I mean, the title of the book is The Trouble with Being Born. So you get a sense of the kind of orientation, philosophical orientation of Cioran. And the aphorism that we're going to be talking about today is as follows. I really like it, by the way. Not that I didn't like the other ones, but I think this is really nice. Consciousness is much more than the thorn. It is the dagger in the flesh. Mm-hmm. Again, consciousness is much more than the thorn. It is the dagger in the flesh. Yeah. So, Ellie, what are your thoughts about this aphorism?
I don't really get it. But maybe thinking it through together will help me get it a little bit more. The reason I say that is because having a thorn in your flesh, this metaphor that first, to my knowledge, comes up in Christian imagery, implies like a thorn in your side. Or no, maybe it's not necessarily Christian imagery. That's like the... Okay, yeah, I'm like conflating Jesus on the cross when he got like a sword in his side with the thorn in the flesh. May or may not be initially Christian imagery.
It's the stigmata, folks. This is about the stigmata.
Like we said, these are off the cuff reflections. Yes. So, which is not always the case in the material that we do here on YouTube as well as in our podcast. But so the thorn in the flesh is something that is uncomfortable, but that you can live with, right? Mm-hmm. It like irks you, but it doesn't actually prevent you from going about your daily business. Having a dagger in the flesh certainly does, right? That dagger is either going to kill you or it's going to require some serious medical attention. You're going to have to pull it out. So I just don't really get it, because consciousness is something that most of us have throughout most, if not all of our lives. And having a dagger in your flesh is not something that you can have throughout most, if not all, of your life.
Well, I mean, that would be the problem with being born, right? That you have this dagger in the flesh.
Yeah, but then you would die. But then you would die of your dagger wound eventually, even if it's not initially a mortal wound. If you never take it out, then you're dying from it. It doesn't seem to me like we die of consciousness.
Isn't it? Like, I think, yes, we kind of die of consciousness and we die in consciousness.
Yeah. It's a cool aphorism. So I'm not trying to just neg on it. I'm just starting from this place of feeling a little bit perplexed as to what it could mean.
Which is the experience of reading aphorisms.
Yeah.
You know, for 90% of the time, is trying to struggle with this seemingly incoherent presentation of ideas that are counterintuitive most of the time. So I would begin this aphorism by thinking about the difference between a thorn and a dagger. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, a thorn is organic. It is a piece of wood that you find in nature. Mm-hmm. And that, yes, it can be a source of discomfort, but in general, you can live with it. That's something that you noted. Whereas a dagger represents a much more fatal danger. It alludes to the rupture of the flesh, potentially the piercing of vital organs.
Yeah.
So it's a distinction between organic and inorganic on the one hand.
And human-made.
Yeah, human-made, specifically for the purposes of piercing.
Yeah.
And also it would be a difference of intensity. Yeah. And so when we think about what consciousness is relative to the flesh, which I take it would here be a stand-in for nature or for the body.
Yeah.
I mean, I do think that is what consciousness is. It's the flesh becoming aware, and that coming into awareness is a kind of suffering. Okay. Right? Because then you receive the world, we suffer the world as conscious beings.
Yeah.
And he seems to be suggesting that suffering is not thorn-like, it's dagger-like.
Yeah.
We are oppressed by our own consciousness.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense, because in that case, then what he's saying is that it's not just as though there's something irksome about our lives, but rather that life is torment. And that certainly jives with Cioran's other general views. Like, he thinks life is horrible, extremely unpleasant. Sort of the only way to get out of the suffering is death. And to that extent, maybe it is true that we eventually die of consciousness. It's just that dagger wound takes a long time to die from, and it's continual agony. So something about the agony of life rather than the irksomeness of life. Those are two very different places on the spectrum of suffering.
Yeah, and I would put that suffering from the dagger not just at the end of life. It's not just that we die from the dagger, but also that we come into being through the dagger. The moment, because if you think about the dagger in the most literal sense of, the insertion of an object that causes tremendous pain, what that brings about is an increasing awareness of it. It brings to mind consciousness in the form of pain, right? That howling cry of suffering. And I take him to think that the dagger is existence. And existence is this awareness of suffering from the beginning to the end.
Well, the dagger is consciousness, but maybe we would say that consciousness and are you saying that consciousness and existence are the same thing?
Yeah, I would say that to be is to be a conscious being. And that's, of course, there are then degrees of consciousness over time.
But certainly in the existential sense, that's a fair characterization, coming out of especially the context of French 20th century existentialism, where, there's a conception of existence as a kind of being that's like very different in kind from many other kinds of...
That is tormented by itself, right? And so I would even interpret the dagger in the flesh not as an object that can ever be removed, but rather that we are beings whose flesh is daggered. Maybe that's not an appropriate use of the term, but I think it's philosophically faithful to the spirit of the aphorism. Because you cannot just be flesh. If you were just flesh, you would just be presumably an animal in his view, or a body endowed with life, but not with existence in the existential sense of the term.
Yeah, it's certainly a gloomy outlook.
I love it.
It's one-sided, because if consciousness is the dagger in our flesh, so too is it the instrument of pleasure. So too is it the instrument of affirmation, of joy. I, as somebody who buys a lot of principles of existentialism, think it's important to disentangle the idea that life involves suffering and anxiety from the idea that life is awful, which is that more pessimistic claim. And as you said, I think Cioran is certainly going in a more pessimistic direction than some of the other existentialists. And so I would maybe want to pull a Nietzsche here and say that yes, life is suffering, but it's also, consciousness is suffering, but it is also what allows us to affirm, to take joy, to take pleasure.
Yeah, and so then that would be a question of the distribution of pain versus pleasure in the life of a particular person. Like, we want to make sure that it's not just all suffering. But I take Cioran to be suggesting that it's not just about particular hedonic states. It's not about me as a person having either a positive or negative experience at this or that moment, but that even when I'm neutral, like, right now we're pretty neutral. We're not like in ecstasy doing this video. We're not in pain either.
Speak for yourself. So pained right now.
But we
can't wait for lunch.
But we are conscious, and on that deeper sense for Cioran, this is the dagger, even this.
Yeah. But I don't mean to limit my claim to hedonic states of pain or pleasure. That's why I also said affirmation, right? So I did say pleasure, that's a hedonic state, but joy, I would say, exceeds that, perhaps, and certainly affirmation. Affirmation is an act. And I worry that this also renders us somewhat passive in the face of life, because if we're treating consciousness as a dagger in the flesh, we're seeing it as foreign to ourselves, and as something that has to be born or undergone, rather than something that we create, at least in part, or that we enact. And I find that to be a more compelling way of thinking about consciousness, even if you want to embrace that it does involve suffering, then a merely like let's undergo it type of situation. And if you're acting and creating, then it's not just about negation, it's also about affirmation.
Yeah, and so that there might be a difference between the life-affirming tendencies of Nietzsche and the more openly and explicitly pessimistic tendencies in Cioran. But be that as it may, we encourage you to read The Trouble with Being Born. We are working here with the Howard translation. And if you like these videos, check out the other ones that we have as part of the series, as well as the rest of the content that we put out on our YouTube channel. We also encourage you to check out our audio podcast, Overthink, where we release episodes every 2 weeks about subjects related to anything philosophical under the sun. And finally,
and that are a bit more research than our off-the-cuff reflections.
Yeah. So this is definitely off the cuff in a way that most of our other content is not quite like that. We also encourage you to support us if you want to become a patron on patreon.com, which would give you access to bonus content, including monthly meetings where we get to chat with our supporters and talk about ideas sort of live. Well, not live in person, but live over a Zoom meeting.
Thank you so much.